Very excited to have the opportunity to share some insights from the TDn2K team today. And I'm going to start it off with Bob Rycroft, who's going to give us a presentation with a lot of insights on the industry.
Thank you, Ricky. Hey, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. As the program resource guide talks about, this is kind of a combination of rear view mirror and crystal ball. So we're going to be talking about a lot of top-level things that TDn2K measures in terms of metrics, but unfortunately we could have a separate conference going into some of the details about what the implications are. This is more of a what is happening, and hopefully the panel will have a chance to talk about some of the whys that are going to be coming along here as well. I'm going to be talking about sales and traffic. We're going to turn it over to Victor for a little bit of discussion on people, and then Kathleen's going to take us through some of the discussions we've got about social. So we're looking forward to sharing this with you, and I want to kick it off, if I can, about talking about restaurant sales and traffic. So much discussion about how we've been doing recently, and here's a graph showing 2015 comp sales for the restaurant industry as a whole, and that green bar in the middle is kind of interesting. You'll see comp sales up about 2.3%, and if you're thinking that's a strong number, you're right. We haven't seen a start to the year as strong as this since 2011. It's been 4 years or so since we've actually seen comp sales at the beginning of the year be this strong. And that's really terrific news. Now, you can also see that growth in all the segments is not necessarily the same. Where quick serve and fast casual have been outpacing the industry, and casual and family trailing a little bit. That's not a new trend. That same trend kind of held up in 2013 and 2014 as well. And casual, again, lagged the industry for the last couple years. So there's a lot of implications for that, and we may talk about some of the pieces that happen, because there are some data points that TDn2K has that aren't really visible here, like day parts. We've seen breakfast become a stronger day part. We've seen late night become a stronger day part. We've seen technology be a factor here, about being able to order on the go and order online, and the kind of mobile applications that might impact some of these segments a little bit differently. We talked about the economy. Maybe doesn't affect everybody the same way. We've talked about national trends in terms of nutrition and desire for convenience that affect some of these segments a little bit differently. If you were here with us in January, you saw or heard Joel talk about how optimistic he was about 2015, and he hasn't changed his story, except now I hear about lumps. We didn't know about lumps before. But we were sitting here looking at an end to 2014 that was really, really very strong. And if you had drawn a trend line, just using 2 years worth of data, to say what would we expect in the beginning of 2015, not knowing anything other than what we knew in the past, that's the trend line that you'd see. And the actuals, there you go. The red line is actually what happened. So it actually came out pretty close to what the trend line was. We had a terrific January. The months since January, while maybe not quite as strong, are still positive. And May now represents the 11th consecutive month of comp sales growth, positive comp sales growth in the industry. So it's a terrific trend, and it's something that we should be proud of, and something that hasn't happened in quite some time. But I do want to talk a little bit about the traffic side of it, because it's a component that we need to be thinking about a little bit. That green or yellow line underneath represents the traffic line, and you can see that the trend line is up, and that's good news for all of us. The not so good part about that is that it's still negative for the most part. And over the last couple years, we've only had like 3 months of positive traffic growth in the restaurant industry. So that's cause for concern that while the sales are up, we still haven't necessarily driven it with strength and people coming through the doors. We used to call it wearing out the carpet. There's another piece of this that I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, and we don't really spend a whole lot of time on this in some of the conferences, but the slope of those lines is a little bit differently. It is a little different. You can see the trend line for sales is going up a little bit faster than the trend line for comp traffic, and that indicates that we're getting more pricing or more check average change than we have in the past. And there might be a couple reasons for that. I mean, going back to what Joel's talking about, there may be some wage pressures making it more likely that brands are raising prices. It could be the commodities are causing us to be looking at pricing a little bit more carefully. And I think another possibility is that in the past, we know that there was a real big focus on discounting and coupons. I mean, you go back a couple of years and everybody had a BOGO, everybody was doing deals, and that had a certain tendency to depress the top line. And I can make the case, maybe, that our friends in marketing have maybe been able to use more surgical techniques as they got tactics and marketing components that maybe drove per person averages up a little bit higher. So if you work with me here on the bottom line on the industry piece, in 2 years ago, the difference between traffic and sales was 2.1%, meaning that some combination of pricing and product mix was 2.1%. If you take a look at it currently, that's 3.3%. That's a big deal. The 3.3% probably represents more pricing than we see typically concepts taking. So there seems to be some sort of trend for us being able to get more dollars out of every visit. And that's a positive thing. I think all of us would feel good about that. But underlying it, we have to really ask ourselves the question about, is it healthy in the long term? Are we doing the right things to drive business into the restaurants? Is it a factor of losing business to, I don't know, to grocery stores? Is it a fact that people aren't coming to restaurants quite as often? We can have a spirited discussion on that. And I would love to hear some of the thoughts that we got. Quick takeaways. Comp sales trending up, it's a good deal. 11 consecutive months of positive increases, we're happy about that. Traffic is trending up, but it's still negative. We've got to focus on that component. And it's increasing at a slower rate than the sales growth is, which implies that PPAs, checks are going up at a faster rate than traffic is, and there are some implications for that. Quick and dirty summary of sales and traffic. Would welcome questions as we go through the conference. Happy to talk with you more about what Black Box has got in terms of being able to interpret that. But for the moment, I'm going to turn it over to my best friend, Victor, and we'll talk a little bit about People Report.
Well, I'm actually going to walk and stand in front. I'm one of the guys, when Joel was talking about the charts and graphs, I'm one of the guys that comes up with the charts and graphs. And just so you're not as bored, I'm going to move around here. So in terms of what's happening in the economy, we heard from Joel about that. We heard from Bob about what's happening on the sales and traffic side of our business. So what I see here, and we've been talking about, is the good news, bad news. The economy is better, sales are going up, traffic is trending up at least. But what all that means is that the labor market is tightening. There's more opportunities out there for our employees, and employees know about it and are actually going for them. And compensation becomes an issue. So those are the two topics I want to touch on today. And we've been talking about these for the last 10 years before recession, and we're back at that point at this point in time. So to start, a lot of lines there. The colored lines going up are turnover for all restaurant employees, both hourly and management. Don't look too much at the numbers themselves, but look at the trend. They're going up. The dotted red line is unemployment. So tying what Joel was talking about before, labor market is improving, high correlation to turnover in the industry. You can notice between 2013 and 14, the pace at which unemployment started dropping accelerated. And at that exact moment, you see the turnover lines go up even faster. So that's the reality of where we are right now. We don't see unemployment rising again anytime soon, or at least not significantly, which means that if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to be seeing the current turnover levels or even higher. We're definitely in an upward trend when it comes to that. Where we are is a problem. It's a challenge definitely for the industry. If you look at the hourly numbers there on the left, those are all median numbers. That means that half of the brands we track as People Report have turnover above those levels. And we're clearly above 100% in 3 of those segments. A lot of people we have to replace. So let's say your brand has 20,000 employees. That's 20,000 employees you're terminating and hiring every single year. If it's 5,000, it's a lot of people. And why that is alarming is it's costly. Our recent study at People Report showed that on average, people spend $1,200, almost $1,200, replacing a single hourly employee. And that's from all hard costs of separation, recruiting, and especially training. It's a lot of money there. When it comes to managers, it's even more alarming. These numbers are higher than what we saw 10 years ago. So if you look at the average turnover in 2005, every single segment there had lower management turnover than what we have now. So it is really a challenge at this point. Top 3 initiative, according to HR groups, in terms of this year, top 3 initiative is reducing turnover, and these numbers show why that is. Now, when it comes to turnover, there's the tendency to say, well, restaurant industry, we're hiring a lot of really young people. Turnover is always going to be high there. They're still figuring out what they want to do. They're going to college, they're going to high school, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at these numbers, it starts becoming real that there is a challenge, there is an issue we need to think about. 27% of all people we terminated last year as an industry were there less than 3 months. Now, no matter what stage in life you are in, I doubt someone goes into a new job thinking, I'm going to be there 2 months and that's enough for me. That's probably not the case. There's some failure there in the employment proposition. If you extend it to a year, it's 2 out of 3 terminations last year were someone there less than a year. So implications for recruiting, are we hiring the right people? I know turnover is high, we need to fill those vacancies, but are we selecting the right fit for the company? Are we engaging them early? We found a correlation between orientation time and turnover. Are we engaging that employee from the beginning? Are we providing the opportunities and the training? One thing I found was interesting is when we asked their member companies what's the primary criteria when hiring an hourly employee, and over half of the companies said, well, it's previous restaurant experience, and this is hourly people, really young employees in most cases. About a fourth of them said previous experience overall at work. Only 8% of them said cultural or personality fit to the company, and maybe that's where some of the disconnect is happening based on these numbers. And it matters. We looked at turnover at the management level and correlated to comp traffic. As we heard from Bob before, traffic is really the main concern for the restaurant industry at this point. And when you look at these numbers, you'll see that those brands that have turnover that's better than their peers, in the green bar there, they're actually up 0.8% in traffic against their peers. The ones that have worse turnover are down 1.4% against their peers. So there's definitely a connection there, and the reason why turnover is so important. It's costly, and it's also costing us business on the other end. What about wages? Like we heard from Joel, there's pressure for wages to go up. There's the minimum wage increases that are coming, the 5 for 15 we've all heard about. So we sought to see, well, what's happening with the restaurant industry so far. And typically when I ask this question, a lot of people say, well, a lot of hourly employees in QSR, especially the team crew members, are minimum wage employees. Whenever I ask, what do you think? People say like it's 80% of all employees or 60% or 50%. Reality, it's only 19% of all QSR team members, the frontline employees, are minimum wage, so it's not a lot. But they're not making a lot more beyond minimum wage. The median wage overall nationally for a QSR team member is $8.16, so very close to their minimum by state. But when you look at how would employees and companies be affected if minimum wage goes up, that's what we have in this graph here. So for each dollar amount there, if minimum wage rose to that number, that's the percentage of employees that would actually see their wages go up. So for QSR, if it goes to $9, 83% of all QSR employees would actually see a wage increase. So that's a big effect in terms of cost for the industry, as Bob was referring to before. It goes to $11 per hour. Now we're talking about practically every single QSR employee. Now and a different example, let's look at casual dining and look at line cooks to isolate the tip issue and just look at straight wage. Actual median wage there is about $11.49 across the country, so it's a little more separated from that minimum wage. So as you can see here, it would take a little more to get to that, but let's say suddenly minimum wage rises to $10 per hour nationally. It's 23% of all line cooks. And then on top of these numbers, you have to think about the compression that happens, right? So you lower the starting wage for people coming in. Those people have been there for a while. You're probably going to have to raise a little bit to compensate for that. So the effect in terms of our cost structure and potentially our prices is very real, and it's a problem for the industry right now. So are we seeing that rise in wages so far? And what we found in our data is that it's only happening where it's more happening at the lower end of the scale. So for example, at fast casual team members, we did see an increase in median wage about 1% by market, same DMA to account for differences in minimum wage by states. But when you look at the line cook position, it's actually coming down a little bit, meaning that we're replacing employees with employees that have probably less experience, they're being paid a little less than were there before. So we're not seeing yet that big push overall, but it's starting to happen at the lower end of the wage scale for industry. So some quick takeaways, I think, for the rest of the year and over the next 12 months. A lot of the same, like I said, unemployment's not going up, so turnover is going to remain high, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. There's the pressure on wages that are happening both for minimum wage as well as just the labor market and what's happening there. We're going to have to pay more if we're going to fill those vacancies, especially with good candidates that we need as an industry. And probably, again, the use of technology to enhance the productivity of those employees if we're going to have that additional wage we need to pay. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kathleen to discuss our newest brand and the results there.
Thanks, Victor. Well, thanks so much, Victor. We're going to kick it over and start looking at some things from a social perspective. So get those hashtag #SBrandCamps going. Just since the beginning of 2015, Whitebox has actually captured over 13 million mentions. And what we're going to do is sort of dig through those mentions segment by segment to give you a little bit of insight that you could take back to your teams and hopefully apply to some of the things that you're working on or put into perspective some of what you're seeing in your own brands. So beginning with casual dining, first of all, we're seeing that guests are certainly active online. They're really active, especially on Yelp, on Instagram, and on Facebook. And if you're getting negative feedback, chances are it's coming through Google. We're also seeing that in terms of that negative feedback, only 7% of food mentions are negative. In general, guests are actually really satisfied with their food experience. It's oftentimes a special occasion, like a birthday or a date. If they are disappointed, it tends to be on the really drastic end of that spectrum, something like food poisoning. On the flip side of that, 31% of mentions about service are actually negative. And we're seeing that most of those mentions are driven by guests complaining about waiting, and they're not satisfied with that experience. So we really see this as an area for improvement and something to keep an eye on in that segment. In terms of fast casual, we're seeing guests are extremely active on Twitter, far and beyond other platforms, far and beyond other segments on Twitter as well. We're also seeing that they're getting really strong positive feedback, especially on Yelp, on Facebook, and even on Foursquare. In terms of the guest satisfaction and really digging into that a little deeper in that segment, only 23% of service mentions are positive, but when they are talking about positive service, they're saying that it was the best service, a really great experience, and they really are genuinely happy. Flip that to 15% of service mentions are negative. Again, it's wait times. So I think two things to notice here. One is that a lot of those mentions are neutral, where the guests aren't really leaving with an impactful experience that's making them say, wow, this was fantastic, or hey, this wasn't so great. And then I think another thing to notice is that 15% of service mentions were negative, but that compares to 30% in casual dining. And both of those are, again, really driven by wait times. So of course, fast casual has a bit of a win there just by the nature of the concept. In terms of upscale casual and fine dining, social sharing is off the charts. A lot of people out there who want to show you just how great and fancy their dinner was. I'm sure you all have a friend like that on social media, right? So these guests are really active on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Yelp. Most of the positive feedback is coming through on Yelp and on Instagram. The really visual nature of Instagram especially is popular in this segment. I'm sure you've seen that in some of your own brands. Guests really wanting to show off just what that experience looked like. In terms of sentiment, digging into some different attributes, 42% of intent on return mentions are actually positive. Again, it's a lot of those special occasion experiences. So we always come here to celebrate my birthday or my anniversary and some sort of an occasion that they're really celebrating at these locations. And then 46% of ambiance mentions are positive. So this was really off the charts compared to any other segment. I think it's something that makes sense. And some trends that we're seeing across this segment are that people talk about things like the music, the table, the view, and we're seeing some of those things at the more granular brand level as well. In terms of family dining, generally the segment's a little bit less active on social and review sites, but we're certainly seeing still a lot of Yelp and Google Plus mentions and a lot of negative feedback coming through Twitter. In terms of what the comments are actually focused on, only 6% of food mentions are negative. And the reason I tell you this is that most of them are completely neutral. Almost anything someone's saying about family dining is just kind of a, meh, I was there. When it comes to the one thing that really stands out, it's intent on return. And we think this is an indicator of consistency, because they're saying things like, it's always good, it's often great, I go back there all the time, and they're getting a very consistent experience each time. In terms of quick service, we're seeing guests are really inactive on review sites. I think this is important to think about, just as when we look at the industry as a whole, we do focus a lot on ratings and review sites and the really great guest feedback that you can get from them, mainly because it's so rich and thorough in content. But in quick service, there just aren't quite as many. And if you're in quick service and you find yourself saying something like, all my guests are on Facebook, they really love Facebook, it might be just because all your positive feedback is coming from Facebook. In fact, 30% of food mentions are positive, and this is one of the ones that Bob and Victor and I were really loving talking about getting ready for this presentation, because the most common thing that someone says about French fries is that they're good, and the second most common thing that they say is that they're so good. They also talk about craving milkshakes, the best food, their delicious burgers. Again, going back to those service mentions, thinking about casual dining and fast casual, 11% of service mentions in quick service were positive. And most of the time when it was positive, they were saying things like, the restaurant was busy, but they were still really kind. So looking ahead on some things that we think we'll see this year, we think we'll see content and engagement that continue to be really important, but they have to begin with social listening. So we think that you really need to know where your industry's trending, where your segment's trending, where your brand is trending before you start pushing content out there. We also think that Facebook policy changes are going to really continue to change the way that we do business on social and change the way that brands have to interact with guests on social. Restrictions in organic content call for new strategies. We continue to see Instagram growing and being more and more influential. Guests are checking in at your locations, they're sharing pictures of their experiences, and that really image-driven content makes it a perfect match for this industry. Review sites continue to give you the best feedback, so they're detailed, rich, thorough, and can really help influence operational change, especially when you start looking at all of your ratings and reviews and all of your social mentions pulled together. You can oftentimes find really impactful insights, maybe at the DMA level or even at the restaurant level, that can help you to understand what's going well and what's not going well operationally. And then we're also seeing emerging platforms, acquisitions, and changes in consumer preferences. So just to think about a couple just in the past month, Yelp hiring bankers, right? We're wondering are they gonna have an IPO or are they not gonna have an IPO? Thinking about Periscope and how this time last year, no one was talking about it, and all of a sudden we're Periscoping live from summer brand camp. Who knows if we'll still be on Periscope 2 months from now, but today it feels huge. And another great example is Urban Spoon. As of Monday, there's no more Urban Spoon, right? They were purchased and all of a sudden they're gone. So it's a changing and dynamic landscape, and I think if there's one thing we can promise you, it's that next year at Summer Brand Camp, there's gonna be something completely different that we're not foreseeing right now. So with that, we'll kick it over to our panel.
Thanks, Kathleen, very much. I think that was some fantastic information from 3 different pieces of the business, and from our people, from the economic perspective, from the results in the business, and from social. Bob, I'm going to start off with a kind of a macro question, and for Bob and maybe Bob both, and Joel. When the economy is strengthening the way that it is, who do you think wins first? If you think about categories across the restaurant industry, who wins first and who wins last with a growing economy?
Well, my view is that the higher end in the income growth has already been there. They're not going to see any significant change in the pattern. Where we're likely to see the largest percentage change in income growth over the next 12 to 24 months is in the lower income to lower middle income levels. So to the extent they may be more directed towards the quick service or family dining, I think that's the place where I would expect that the strengthening economy, to the extent that it does create this rise in wages, to show its biggest impact.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point. Going back to that segment growth chart that I had up in the beginning, I talked about where the relative positioning was of quick serve and fast casual. Upscale and fine dining has been the one segment that over time has increased at a more rapid pace than the other segments. So they might have trailed the industry 2 or 3 years ago, but they're above the industry today. And Victor and I have been talking before about some of the market share data that we have, and there's a lot of activity in the upscale end. When you think about some change like Fogo de Chao, Yard House, Seasons 52, brands that are growing. So I think maybe the upscale has seen a benefit here as the economy has increased, and potentially that now can filter down into some of the other segments where price points might be a little bit more of an issue.
I think in unpacking the data that you had between sales and traffic, I think total sales certainly reflect that. It's interesting to see, as I was looking at that QSR was the only category that has positive traffic on a year-to-date basis in 2015. Ranges from declines of 2.5% in the family dining segment to 1.5% in the higher end. So I think, would agree with you, Joel, and Bob both. I think that the higher end upper dining has certainly benefited and had some tailwinds behind it, but the lower end is starting to gain some traction. Also, to stay on an economic question, how do you see that the varying impact across generations? Because I think there's a lot of generational things going on within our industry between the growing incomes and free time of boomers, the growth in overall spending power of millennials from an aggregation standpoint, and Gen X moving into a life of a lot of commitments, whether it be mortgages, families, and those type of things. As you look at it from a generational standpoint, Joel and Bob, how would you see that?
Well, I think we need to look at, let's look at the two big groups, the millennials and the boomers. In the millennials, I think we're looking at two competing forces over the next few years. As I said before, they will become the largest, and are very rapidly becoming the largest group in the workforce. If they're going to be 75% of the workforce in 10 years, the rate of growth is pretty rapid at this particular point. And you would expect, especially over the next few years, as they move up within companies and their incomes rise in a more normal pattern, that they would have a greater share of the demand side of the restaurant industry. The only issue that's at stake there, well, there are two issues that are at stake there. One is the simple fact that millennials are very burdened by their student loans, and that's constraining factors. And the second thing is they're beginning to go through that transitional period in their lifestyle. It's one thing when they're not married or newly married and eating out is a necessity. When they're married and have kids, does eating out remain a necessity or become a luxury once again? This is something we just don't know. There's a different psychology within the millennials than there are in the boomers. On the boomer side, I don't expect, even as they begin to retire more and more, there'll be a large change in their spending habits, although I suspect they will slow down the purchases at the upper end and move it more towards the middle end, but not a significant change.
Kathleen, when you think about social media, there's some very distinct differences on the type of channels that were used across the different categories. Do you have a perspective on what's driving that? Is it the type of use, do you think? Is it the user from a demographic standpoint?
Yeah, so one thing to start with on demographics is Pew publishes some great research on that. So if you're interested in trying to understand where your demographics are playing on social, that's my recommendation. I think in terms of the platforms themselves, they just offer different ways to provide feedback. So if you are at a fancy restaurant and you really want to show off the experience, you might want to write a 3-paragraph review on Yelp, but you might not have quite that much to say about your burger at In-N-Out, right? you can very quickly tweet, "My fries are good, so good." You don't need to go on Yelp and write a whole story about it. So I think a lot of it has to do with just the way that the content is shared on those platforms. And it varies brand to brand too. So we were looking at what it looks like for segments, but even within brands, things can be really different. And oftentimes brands are surprised at where their guests really are talking about them.
Great. Victor, I want to move over to a people question, if I could, and stay connected to social media. What do you think the role of social media is and the opportunity for social media between a brand or a company and its team members, both from attraction to the engagement and the development of their team?
I think it's a great question, and I think we've been talking about this for a few years now, and how the brand is one across the board as a consumer, as an employee, and it needs to represent on both ends of that spectrum. So someone was saying yesterday, I think it was Wendy Clark, where the employees have to love your brand before your customers can love your brand, and that is part of that, is the interaction with your employees, is having that voice of the employee and that communication with them, which happens both at the consumer side as well, and make it one voice and one integrated brand promise for employees to understand the brand. And I think, like I was saying before, engagement and cultural and preference fit, I think it's a big part of what we might be missing in terms of employees in some cases, and a big part of that is communicating to them through those channels, which is where a lot of these people are to begin with, communicating.
And to play off the brand fit and the engagement side, I think you had a stat that said only 8% of the hiring decision was based upon a brand fit. When you think across the category and the insight that you have against different businesses and how they perform, do you have an idea of, or top of mind, what a best practice could be around that, or some folks that are doing a fantastic job with that?
We're starting to look at that. That's a survey we did earlier this year. So we're still at the beginning stages of that. But yeah, one of the next steps is over time track that and see our brands that are consistently looking for that fit doing better in terms of the results. That's a great question.
So as part of a wrap-up, the team's put together some consolidation slides that pulls together the information across the three different areas of focus. And Victor or Kathleen?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're really trying to focus on as a team across all three products is helping you to really understand what are the drivers in your business. So you're seeing trends happen, what's making them happen, and Victor's the fabulous insights man behind it all that's pulling together all those dots. So he's going to help walk us through a couple of those drivers that we've seen sort of connect together over the past year.
Thanks, Kathleen. So the first step, the first place we want to start in terms of looking at this, we had a lot of data from all of our three different sources. We put it all together and see what's there. All of this is at the brand level. Like Kathleen was saying before, at the individual brand level, you see differences. So what is important for one brand is not necessarily important for another. Different segments, different perspectives, but also within brands there's differences. But we wanted to look at what holds true across brands, and it's proof that all of this connects, and we need to be looking at all these pieces separately. So the first place we started was with Yelp. There's a lot of controversy a lot of times in terms of Yelp, and is it real? Are people actually showing their sentiment there? Is it a reflection of guest satisfaction? So what we took here is we took all of our brands and looked at the percentage of positive reviews on Yelp. So when people go on Yelp and talk about your brand, those brands that have over 50% of those reviews be positive, we found out that their traffic is actually slightly positive. Now think about where we are on traffic and how it's a big challenge and how we're losing people. It shows there that when you get those people to have a good experience at your restaurant, they're actually talking about it online, and it's reflecting on your traffic growth. Look at the other bar there, the ones that have less than 50% of their reviews be positive, they have a very, very dramatic drop there, 3% down in terms of traffic. So there's a big difference there. So what this is saying to me is you're actually measuring guest satisfaction, and through that it's also feeding back into people go and look at those reviews and say, well, I want to go to this place because it's obviously a better place than the other brand down the road. What about Google? Again, you're looking for the restaurant, you Google it, you see those reviews on the side, you look at the stars, you start reading some of those. When brands get over 50% of their comments be negative, which is the bar on the right there, 50% negative comments or more, the big drop in traffic, 3% down. Those that have the better results in terms of not as many negative, they're actually almost flat in terms of traffic. So kind of the same pattern as we saw before. Again, guest satisfaction being measured and shown through the social interaction. And because we have the three buckets and we want to see how all those dots connect together, we said, well, what about the people side? Are we seeing the same thing there? So again, with the theme of Google negative mentions, what we found is that those brands that have a higher percentage of negative mentions have higher turnover than their peers, the 10.5 or 10.8% there on the right, against their peers to account for differences in segments. And the ones that have a lower percentage of negative mentions actually are doing better than their peers in terms of turnover. So what all this is telling us is, first of all, like we saw before, turnover matters. Better turnover results at the brand level is driving a better guest experience. That guest experience is actually being reflected through those reviews. And it's not just a review there, it's actually something that happens on the business side of things. You're getting better traffic when you get the better turnover and when people are more satisfied. So that proves to us that there's the value of looking at all those different pieces and connecting all those different dots, because they're all part of the same whole that's our businesses as an industry.
All right, well, Joel, Kathleen, Victor, and Bob, I want to thank you for this information. Some fantastic, I think, insight and very interesting in how it all pulls together. So thanks very much. Appreciate that.
I don't like it. I love it, love it, love it. Uh-oh. So good.